What's up, Womack Nowstalgia? Dave here with a review of Kraven the Hunter, the new superhero film from Sony, their latest Spider-Man adjacent film that doesn't actually feature Spider-Man, following the grand success of films such as Madam Web and Morbius, and of course the Venom trilogy. Kraven was delayed several times, finally coming out now, and the response or lack thereof to this film, the tracking at the box office coming down, opening to a paltry 11 million, that's under Madam Web's small opening, shows that the audience investment in Sony's take on the Spider-Man verse is, at the end. There's just no buy-in to this storytelling. I mean, Venom 3, which we just got, was the lowest grossing of the trilogy, and yes, are the Venom movies broadly successful monetarily? Sure, but I think this whole venture from a storytelling perspective has failed. I think that's pretty obvious, and maybe in a different time they would have cast a second Spider-Man for these movies, but the fact that they're kind of serving two masters, where they have the Tom Holland movies that they are involved in, of course, with Marvel Studios, and those are successful, and they're making a fourth one, filming it next year. They have those movies, and they make also making these other movies, mining the Spider-Man IP that they own, and they're making these movies without the best piece of it, which is these villains fighting and interacting with Spider-Man. Obviously, superhero films have been in decline for some time. We've seen that with Marvel. We've seen that with DC. We've certainly seen that with Marvel at Sony. So it's part of the wider trend. But these films also are the least successful of the whole grouping at this point. And Craven, a different world, maybe in 10 years ago, I think the movie, for what it exactly is today, would be probably a lot more successful. I think people would be a lot more lenient with this film. Directed by J.C. Chandor, he's made several quite good movies, talented director, starring, a really capable leading man in Aaron Taylor Johnson. The rest of the cast actually is pretty stacked, honestly, with Russell Crowe and Ariana DeBose and Fred Hetchinger and Christopher Abbott. Like, it's very talented. The biggest issue with Kraven the Hunter is that this is a superhero film that makes a lot of the mistakes that were rectified 10 plus years ago. Super traditional superhero origin story is a lot less compelling than it used to be. And a character like Kraven, turning him into more of a hero or anti-hero because he needs to lead a movie on his own and not be a antagonist to Spider-Man, because this movie doesn't have Spider-Man, it just doesn't really track. I like Aaron Taylor Johnson in the role. He doesn't have a whole lot to work with, but I think he's pretty capable with screen presence and his physicality and things like that. My biggest takeaway with Craven is that I'm worried that this movie's poor performance is going to negatively impact Aaron Taylor Johnson's chances of becoming the next James Bond. He's long been rumored to be, a favorite of the Broccoli family when it comes to being the next Bond. This movie opening super poorly. The tracking just kept coming down to only 11 million. That's a major flop on his record, even if ultimately the market forces regarding superhero movies like Craven isn't really on Aaron Taylor Johnson at all. I think he would be a good choice for Bond. Loved him in Bullet Train. He's been on a good run in general. I thought he was awesome in Tenet. I'm a little worried this might negatively impact him more than it probably should. But yeah, like I said, I think this movie just makes a lot of those sins. I mean, Fred Hetchinger's character barely has any presence in this movie, and I was wondering why a rising actor such as Hetchinger was even in the part at all. And then, of course, you see the very end of the movie where it's effectively setting up future Craven stories that, of course, will never be told, and then it makes a little bit more sense. Ariana DeBose, I think she's all right in this movie. It's kind of a little bit outside of her traditional wheelhouse, but I mean, you got to think when this movie was greenlit, when this movie was even filmed, this was right after her Oscar win, so it was probably a nice check for her. Russell Crowe is probably the most disappointing of all the big actors in this, just because he's just kind of doing the Russian caricature. He even drinks vodka straight from the bottle multiple times. He's not doing a whole lot besides just kind of laying on the accent kind of thick. I think Crow in general, at late period Crow has been a bit disappointing, to say the least, the roles he's taking and stuff. So he doesn't make that big of an impression. He should be, I think, more villainous and have a little bit more depth than he ends up having. And Christopher Abbott, his whole character, feels very hamstrung into the movie in the first place, and probably ultimately wasted. In general, I feel like Christopher Abbott has a lot of franchise appeal, despite also being a really, neurotic, quirky actor. Shout out Poor Things. Like, he is ultimately wasted in the franchise game in this role. The main villain is actually Alessandro Nivola as the Rhino, which I think he's fine in that, but there's just not enough time spent on the villainy side of things with this movie. I think the storytelling is just so thin, and we spend so much time with the origin story, which I think is a lot less interesting. I think the best stuff in this movie is some of the action set pieces, which are pretty good. Just watching Kraven kick ass, and be superhuman with his abilities. The movie has a lot of CGI. There's a lot of animals involved in this. I think for the most part, the CGI isn't bad by any means. And this movie actually was made for, after some ballooning budgets with the delays and stuff, only like 110. Again, like I think in a different world 10 years ago, that's a really competitive budget for a superhero film, and this movie would have, I think, been successful. But it's just coming at a time where there's just no patience for a movie like this, which definitely feels like an old school superhero movie for good and bad. By all accounts, Sony has no plans to make any more of these Spider-Man adjacent films. The Venom films are definitely done. We're not getting sequels to Morbius or Madam Web or Craven after how they performed, and nothing else is in the pipeline. Nothing else is being greenlit. I think anything that had been discussed in the past, Silver Sable, Black Cat, like none of that's happening. So apart from the Spider-Verse films, animated of course, which are wrapping up in time but will have their own spin-offs, that's kind of the only thing Sony's got going on right now. I think they're really focused on Spider-Man 4 with Holland, and I think this world can probably open back up to them in a post-Holland world. But even then, you would think that Sony and Marvel Studios would just pivot to Miles Morales in live action. So, yeah, this whole venture was kind of brought out of the superhero excess era that we know is over. It's similar to how Marvel Studios made tons of movies and primarily TV shows on Disney Plus about ancillary characters and supporting characters, and that's just not going to happen moving forward. That's just a different strategy and I think a different budget consciousness nowadays. So this movie, in a sense, is kind of the last product of a bygone era in a certain sense. And yeah, there's really not a whole lot to dwell on with it. It's a movie that goes in one ear and out the other. But let me know though, what did you think of Craven? What was your favorite aspect of it? And for more movie reviews, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.